Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar, which is part of the Grooming and Coercive Control Summit 2023, hosted by Neurodiverse Connection. If you haven't heard of us before, Neurodiverse Connection is a community interest company that exists to elevate the voices of neurodivergent people to help them flourish and thrive. The Grooming and Coercive Control Summit is our first ever event series, so we're delighted that you've chosen to join us and to be part of this. This is an issue that affects many lives, but is rarely talked about openly. We believe that challenging the stigma that surrounds it can help to accelerate positive change in a critical area. So before we start today, I've just got a couple of housekeeping remarks. This webinar will be followed by a live Q&A session. At Neurodiverse Connection, we're committed to promoting the use of neurodivergent affirming language. Our guide to neurodivergent affirming language is available in our resource library. However, please note that these webinars, as with any content we host or share that has input from other organisations or parties, we can't guarantee that the preferred neurodivergent affirming terminology is always used. Due to the nature of the summit, there's a content warning for all our webinars on grooming, abuse and coercive control. This webinar discusses two related research projects by Dr Nicole Renehan, Assistant Professor in Criminology at Durham University, on the Criminal Justice Domestic Violence Perpetrator Programme, or the DVPP, for England and Wales, Building Better Relationships, and an international project in which she explored the experiences and perspectives of domestic abuse practitioners who'd adapted their interventions to make them inclusive of neurodivergent men. The research projects identified that autistic men and those with ADHD experience adversities and barriers to engagement on programmes that were both similar and above those of neurotypical men. These research projects represented the first studies internationally to obtain the views of neurodivergent men who perpetrate domestic abuse and to detail the challenges they faced. Our webinar today is chaired by Meena Kumari, who's the director and founder of Hope Training. Meena and Nicole will introduce themselves in their video, so I'll now hand over to them.
Hi everybody, my name is Meena Kumari and I am from Hope Training and Consultancy, and I'm really lucky today because I'm going to be speaking to an amazing academic that's been doing some amazing work in the sector. So we've got Dr Nicole Renehan today, who's going to be talking to us about her work with working with neurodivergent perpetrators. I'm just going to now just kind of come over to Nicole and just first of all, I'm just going to ask you to introduce yourself to the audience if that's okay.
I'm Nicole, Assistant Professor at Durham University. Also have a practice background in domestic abuse as well.
I just wanted to kind of start off with just asking you, Nicole, could you just tell the audience a little bit about your research? So just kind of from the beginning, like why did you put it together? What's it about? And then what were your initial findings?
Okay, so it's actually, it covers two research projects. So it started with my doctoral research when I was looking at the Building Better Relationships programme. And for those who don't know that, it's our current domestic abuse perpetrator programme within the criminal justice system. So I did some research with practitioners and perpetrators who were attending the programme within a probation setting. And really that was about trying to get an understanding of how the programme worked, what were some of the barriers to it working, or what could support men in making these changes. And I was very much interested in both the lives of the men and the facilitators that were delivering the programme to see in what ways that sort of had an impact or sort of came into play in the context of delivery. So what I hadn't intended on finding was interviewing a couple of neurodivergent men. So I wasn't prepared for it. And when I found this out through looking at pre-sentence reports and also talking to them about it, I sort of asked some follow-on questions. And it wasn't really until I got to the analysis that I realised actually just how important this was in terms of research, because it hasn't been looked at before. And I'll give you an idea of just some of the things that had come up at the time. So, for example, an autistic man who I called Trevor, had, the same as the other men in the programme, had a difficult life experiences. We know that this is often happens in the lives of men who perpetrate domestic abuse. So some of that was around sort of trauma and violence in the home, and other experiences sort of within society, school, and having problems. But he also talked very much as an autistic man about having sort of felt very different throughout the course of his life, not fitting in, and sort of being misunderstood. And this sort of sense of isolation had really created further compounding difficulties, experiences, and inequalities throughout his life. And the same was for the ADHD young man that I spoke to. He again came from a background that was full of sort of adversities, sort of school, sort of thrown out of school very early on, and found himself within the criminal justice system prematurely as well. But again, he talked very much about having experienced and been treated very differently, both within his family and also within society. He had been banned from lots of universal services and felt very much persecuted by the services who should have been there to support him, not negating the fact that these two men would have been very difficult for service providers and practitioners to work with. When it came to the programme itself, so some of the difficulties that they talked about was things like a noisy environment, and not really fully understanding sort of the what was expected of them in terms of the programme. And the other sort of thing that came up was things around sort of other people in the room, in terms of how they got on with the other people in the room, and perhaps not engaging until there was a smaller group till the numbers had dropped off. So by the time I got to the end of this and I'd looked at the analysis, there was clearly much more to understand. I hadn't asked enough questions, and because it was an unexpected finding, I hadn't asked the practitioners directly about working with neurodivergent people. So that there came in the second project. I decided to do an international piece of work in conjunction with the Monash Gender, Family and Violence Prevention Centre in Australia, Melbourne. And I should say that Professor Kate Fitzgibbon was part of that research with me as well. So what we did was Kate and I did a survey trying to identify specialists, or not necessarily had to be specialists, but services who had adapted their intervention in some way to be suitable for neurodivergent people. And we did that across the UK and Australia. And of course, it might have been that people just didn't want to answer the survey. It might have been too long or whatever, but I think we only got something like 12 responses across both countries, which was really sort of telling in terms of, I suppose, the availability of services for neurodivergent people. So the other part of that research was I conducted interviews with people internationally across the world. That was people in, managed to get people in the UK, Australia, the Netherlands, and the US. And as part of that, pulled together some of the findings from the survey and from the interviews, and some of the issues that were identified were, not surprisingly, that interventions aren't made with neurodivergent people in mind. They're made by, for, and delivered by and for neurotypical people. And I know the resources are from the report that we developed as a result of the project will be on the website, Neurodiverse Connection website. But some of the challenges were, again, some of the things that we talked about in the context of the perpetrators that I interviewed. So things around sort of sensory sensitivities within the environment, and perhaps looking beyond that. So we, in the UK, we have a legal responsibility to provide reasonable adjustments to disabled people within the Equality Act. So some of the practitioners talked about some of these reasonable adjustments that they had made and people could make within their interventions. But one of the things that really interests me more than that is thinking about how neurodiverse people, so thinking in the context of the group, interact with each other and experience that space. So the group dynamics, the emotions that are going on in the room, as you will know, perpetrator intervention's been a space in which there are a lot of hostilities going on. And then thinking, as we know, about the therapeutic alliance, working alliance is really important in terms of getting people on board, because that's really important in terms of thinking how we engage people in interventions so that we can support them and change. So these were some of the things that have come out in terms of being really interesting. We need to move beyond thinking about just reasonable adjustments within the environment, but also how do we experience being in a room with a whole host of different neurodiversity, and therefore thinking about that as well as sort of the reasonable and sort of easier adjustments to make. So that's a whole lot of talking. It was a whole lot of projects, so I'm happy for you to pick up, because I might have missed out some stuff.
I mean, it was really interesting as someone who is neurodivergent themselves and someone who delivers levels of interventions with survivors and perpetrators. It's really nice to sit here and listen to you talk about not just reasonable adjustments, which we should be making anyway, but actually just thinking about those group dynamics when you have got someone who might have that sensory overload or no noise overload. And it's just making me think about some of the men that I worked with previously, because you automatically get that hostility when they first come into the room, but it's also their environmental factors that's going to make a massive issue or a massive impact around that engagement as well. And just to emphasize to anyone who's listening back to this webinar, the paper that Nicole has done and a lot of her work is on the website. So it is on Neurodiverse Connections website. Please have a look. Please click on the links and go and have a look at the other work that she's done with her university as well, because she's phenomenal in the sector. She's constantly doing great work. So please have a look at that back. The second thing I wanted to ask you, I'm just kind of looking back at the questions. When you think about frontline services and kind of frontline practitioners, and those, you know, who are working with perpetrators or those kind of using those harmful behaviors who are neurodivergent, what can they do differently then to engage and offer that inclusive service? So what's some of the things that has come out that you've learned that we, you know, you can almost promote to services that are listening in?
I mean, the first thing I'd say that we have to do is ask. It's as simple as asking someone as part of the assessment process, what do you need to be able to engage more effectively in this intervention? And I think quite often when we talk about needs, we try to see needs as something specific to a specific group of people. I mean, what I identified was that actually some men might need one-to-one work. Some men cannot tolerate group work, but that would be the same for neurotypical men as for neurodivergent men. So we can't assume that all neurodivergent men would therefore not want to be part of a group. Actually, we need to think of groups as like little societies, if you like, and where we all learn from each other. We don't sort of take a country and put pockets of different people in different places, and actually a place for learning about diversity and being tolerant and being inclusive it's a really good place to sort of start in the group. So for some people, it may be that they just have to, they need to do one-to-one work, but actually we can learn an awful lot from each other, and our differences and doing things differently is what the practitioners that I spoke to said. So asking when someone first comes to see you through an assessment process, I mean, there's different views in terms of whether we ask someone whether they're neurodivergent or not, whether that's, some people would say, yes, we do need to be asking, why wouldn't we ask someone if they were neurodivergent? Why is that something that we would leave out? Whereas other people would say everything should be needs-led. And I think there's a bit of a balance to be struck with both really there. Just don't make assumptions. When you ask if someone's neurodivergent, expect go and find a tick box of things you should do. So I would say that would be the first thing to do, is ask. There also needs to be sort of really basic neurodiversity training so that it gives practitioners the confidence in what to do, what questions to ask, and the confidence in knowing that there are things that they can do to make their environments more neurodivergent friendly. So making them inclusive for everyone there. And it might be things like, a part of that training, someone might need to just come in for an additional visit first off, so that they can be sort of familiarise themselves with the setting. They might want to look through the programme materials in advance. A bit like when we think about interviewing people, and one of the things to make that more inclusive, which I'm doing in the project I'm sort of running at the moment, is actually giving people out the opportunity to have a look at things first. We're not trying to catch people out. So I think as part of the training, it would give people confidence to ask these sort of questions and think about what they could do. But that training needs to be done by neurodivergent-led organisations with or neurodivergent-led organisations. There's a real risk of neurodiversity as a concept being co-opted by, I don't know, certain areas, disciplines, however we would like to put it, and making lots of assumptions based on sort of the deficit model, language and way of working. So that needs to be done in conjunction. And in terms of other things, working with neurodivergent-led organisations, again, part of the research I'm looking at just now, you can ask me about that after if you want to, but it's about making sure that everyone who has those expertise are involved in working together to ensure that they put interventions together that aren't just based on sort of one area's views of how something should be, coming together with neurodivergent-led organisations as well as experts in the field of domestic abuse to have a look at how do we make interventions more inclusive for all people who would benefit from being in that environment and challenging looking at the behaviour.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things you've just said there. My mind's going like this because I'm like, oh my God, the number of men I've seen come into a room just before they've gone onto a programme and they're like shuffling the papers, or, you know, there's something about their body language and you just assume it's because people are nervous, you're going to be sitting in a room with people you don't know. But actually, you know, I know where services don't ask that direct question, you know, or do you have any neurodiverse needs? Are you neurodivergent? Because they are very much needs led. It's kind of waiting to see what those needs are. But at the same time, as a practitioner who still does on the ground stuff, everything you're saying, I'm like, I've seen that, I've dealt with that. And if I'd had that information beforehand, I could have potentially just gone out and been a bit more like, you know, we're aware, don't worry, come in. And we do that anyway, because we want to engage. Of course, we want to engage perpetrators with the work that we do. We want to see change. We want victims to be safe. We want children to be safe. We want perpetrators to not reoffend. You know, all those things come into it. There's a reason why we do what we do. So that was just phenomenal, kind of what you said there. And I think it's really important, if you are a service listening back, you do kind of take that on board and really think about what Nicole just said and read the research, look at the research where she's talked about it. Tell me about the second part of the research that you're doing, that what you're going on to then, because that sounds really interesting. Why have you decided to do that?
So the third part, so that's
third part.
So that's the two that I spoke about before. So the third part, which is actually, I would almost say it was the 2B, it became, it's in the middle of 2 or 3. It's sort of, it should have been, it wasn't going to happen. There's sort of another part that I'm done to around victim survivors, but suddenly felt, actually, I'm not sure, because I'm learning as I go along through this as well. I'm not sure that the research that I've done with international practitioners would land well with neurodivergent-led organisations. So I've just started, I'm just doing pilot interviews at the moment. So I'm taking the recommendations from that report and sharing those with neurodivergent-led organisations and getting their views on whether those recommendations are right, and having further discussions around some of the things that have been found, views on actually how to make these services more neurodivergent friendly from people who actually are neurodivergent themselves and where their priority is about making the world more neurodivergent friendly and sort of accessible to people as well. So I've only undertaken one interview so far. It was so exciting. I get so excited doing this diversity work. It really does. Well, I suppose, like I've said to you there before, when we bring people into a room who are different, we learn from people from all different aspects of life, and it's really given me some hope around how change might happen through this sort of neurodiversity lens, this different angle, because if we make our services neurodiversity friendly, which means all of us, it means we capture everyone. So yeah, so I'm just at the very beginning of that, speaking to neurodivergent led organisations. So if anyone does watch this interview and wants to get involved in a neurodivergent led organisation, I'd be really, really keen to speak to you, and I'll send you out loads of information about the project. And then what that's going to lead on to. So one of the really interesting things that sort of came up as part of speaking to practitioners within the domestic abuse field, if we are not looking at neurodivergent perpetrators, we're looking even less so at their partners.
Yeah.
What does that victim support work look like? What does that family makeup look like? And also, I mean, Project 5, what are we teaching neurodivergent men within the context of our developed and delivered buying for neurotypical people? What are we teaching them on these programs? There's lots of assumptions being made about how men who come onto the program need to learn how to communicate and resolve conflict within the home. But they're all very neurotypical ways of thinking about conflict and communication. And for me, the concern might be, and I know applied behavioural analysis will be spoken about within this summit as well, is it another sort of coercive form of intervention that we are imposing upon neurodivergent people and their families, because we're making assumptions, neurotypical assumptions about how they need to behave in their families? And is that creating more issues? Because actually the differences in communication and needs within that family in the context of domestic abuse, what complicates that, will be so different. So there's lots of projects. I think this will keep me going until I retire.
I was just about to say, what's that? Project 6 or Project 7 you've just described? But actually, you've raised Project 5. You've raised a really, really good point, even down to the materials, who they've been written by, who's consulted on the materials, how they're delivered. Even the way I was trained to deliver my materials, I would say it was in a very typical neurotypical kind of way. And, you know, I'm quite comfortable to raise when I'm on training, if I'm on training where I've got to go on to then deliver something as a neurodivergent person myself, that actually I need to learn that in a different way, because I'm not really taking that on board. And, you know, I'm very communicative like this, and all those things kind of attached to it. But not everyone, Nicole, will do that, and not everyone will kind of recognise that as well. So I think it's really interesting that if we are then implying it onto certain neurodivergent perpetrators and families, like, what are we recording? What are we picking up? Because we're doing it in a way that suits kind of, you know, the typical sense, not the others. And, you know, I feel really passionate about that in other areas of work that I do. So I totally get what you're saying. There's so much stuff going on. One of the things I want to emphasize is what Nicole's just said, though, about the next part of her research. And if anyone is interested, so if you are working in an organization and you do want to contribute to that research, please get in touch with her, because we need things like this to help us when we're doing frontline work, to ensure that we are being truly inclusive and we are considering all of these needs as well. Nicole, is there anything else that you want to add and tell the audience about your work?
I feel like I've just given my
really open question.
Life plan.
Really open question.
I think one of the biggest concerns I have, and this is threaded through the work and research that I've done previously, so it comes back to my own practice background. It comes through the research that where I identified neurodivergence as something to be explored, as well as when we're just thinking about neurotypical working and interventions, that the real challenge we face is securing, attracting, retaining the workforce to be able to do this. And of course, one of the things that we need to be able to do is make sure we have a representative workforce. So I cannot stress enough that it's really important to be including within your adverts when you're applying, sort of you want people to apply for work within your organisation. We already say that we sort of welcome or stress that we would want to encourage people from all different minoritised backgrounds to come forward. Really emphasise that we value neurodivergent people, and obviously make sure that your organisation then is also a neurodivergent friendly place to welcome a host of different neurodiversity to your workplace as well. And that will add value. So some of the practitioners I spoke to internationally were neurodivergent themselves, and sometimes it was really difficult for them to pinpoint and say, this is what I do, or this is how you should do it, because actually they were saying this is just, it was like not second nature but first nature to them. They were attuned automatically to someone who was neurodivergent. They talked about not even having to translate, but they were also attuned to everyone else in the room. So there was something about being neurodivergent that made them attuned not only to other neurodivergent people, but those skills and that intuition was readily applied to all other people in the room, because they had an understanding around diversity and relating that could be applied more broadly. But saying that, that is a way forward. We already know that the sector is struggling in terms of workforce, trying to recruit and retain. It's a feminised sector, and we know what happens when a sector is feminised. the work is low value and low pay in a lot of situations. So for me, again, you'll see it in my report that one of the things we really need to be doing, we need cross-governmental strategies and agreements that work hand in hand with universities, with neurodivergent-led organisations, with the domestic abuse sector, and with neurodivergent people themselves, to think about a recruitment strategy and training, so that actually the people that we have delivering programmes are valued, highly skilled, and stay in the sector because they're highly valued. Yeah. So that's where I would sort of end it.
Yeah, well, you heard it here first. No, you heard it here first. This is what we need, and it's something that I feel so passionate about. I've done loads of projects where we've particularly focused at Hope around race and racialized communities and how do you recruit and retain and keep that talent. And it's exactly the same. And actually, you know, if I ever left Hope tomorrow and went to go and apply for another job and I was looking at an organization, that neurodiversity would be really important to me as someone, you know, who has practiced that, someone who experiences it. It has been impacted by my neurodiversity, but also has used it as an asset, because I just think we are really talented people as well. And all those things kind of attached to it. And it's one of the biggest reasons why Hope and ND Connection actually came together and supported this work, because we didn't have to explain additional things to each other. That understanding was just there. It's been absolutely amazing to speak to you and to understand your research. I cannot thank you enough for your time. I really hope, you know, people that watch this back, please keep watching it back, you know, get what you need out of it. There's so many resources on the website. Please give Dr. Nicole a follow as well. She is on Twitter as well, so please give her a follow. And thank you so much for coming on, and, you know, good luck with all the research that you're doing.
Fantastic. So thank you to Meena and Nicole for that conversation. We're now going to go to the Q&A. We've had quite a few come in. I've been furiously scribbling down as well. That a conversation was taking place. But to start us off, Nicole, I was really delighted to hear your reflections on kind of the strengths and importance of having a neurodivergent workforce and how that can benefit actually everyone accessing the space. You gave a couple of examples of where you'd seen that was making a difference, and I was just curious to know if those examples are shared anywhere. You know, are there any kind of stories or examples that we could point people to to share what's working and how powerful it can be to have a diverse workforce?
I think it's quite complicated because this is really, really early days, which is reflected in, I suppose, when I said that about that survey, just the little take up that there was, and how difficult it was to recruit people around the world who were already working in this space, never mind being neurodivergent themselves. And not everyone that I spoke to wanted to be identified, so I gave people the opportunity to be sort of recommended within the report. I suppose all I can say for now, I mean, it's taken, as research and peer review does take some time, but obviously you can point people to the report that's on the website to look at. But I will, fingers crossed, I've sort of presented on 2 papers this year that I'll be writing over the course of next year. And I'm hoping to get them out as quick as that will possibly come out. But it's sort of that, it's within that context that I sort of give more about what practitioners are saying in terms of being neurodivergent themselves and what that offers to sort of a diverse population that they're working with. Again, I'll probably just come back to one of the things that I'd said there is that it was really difficult. Like normally when I've asked practitioners before, what is it that you do to engage perpetrators on programs? It comes down as a bit of a tick list of, it feels like the very technical jargon that facilitators are given on the technicalities of managing group work and working alliances and things. Oh, I'm pro-social, I'm non-judgmental, I give space, or I use humour, those sorts of things. But it's very difficult for someone to say, how is it that you just happen to be a person that can engage another person? And they found it really difficult to say, I'm not quite sure what it is I'm doing, I just get them. So I think there's lots more to be done, and I'm hoping that my research is just a bit of a springboard. I've interviewed very few men by accident on a piece of research who are neurodivergent, and went out and spoke to 10 practitioners, 3 or 4 of whom were neurodivergent. That's the very, very beginning of all of this. Perhaps where you could go to more broadly is there will be organisations out there, there's a huge amount on LinkedIn that they talk about more broadly having a neurodiverse workforce, regardless of that just being around perpetrator intervention. So probably reaching out to those who are already thinking in that way outside of the domestic abuse sector. Probably not the best, the most useful of answers, but like I say, right at the beginning of all this.
Yeah, and I really really appreciate your pioneering work and that these conversations are happening. And I think it's really exciting to be at the beginning and to see it unfolding. And you know, often we have to learn across sector, don't we? We have to look at what's working and how it's working in other places and think about how we can integrate that learning. Yeah, so it really makes sense, and I think it's a strength to look across sectors. I noticed as I was listening to your conversation with Meena, the first question I came up with was like, so like, what are the changes that people can make? And it's really interesting how, like, I thought I found myself falling into that, like wanting a checklist, like what are what are the things that people can do? What are the quick wins? Without it becoming kind of tokenistic or a checklist, and absolutely appreciating what you said about the need to ask and to personalize it and to make this part of our process. Are there changes that you think that organisations can make to be more accessible to everyone?
Well, this is where you come to your reasonable adjustments. Very important. And I never mean to downplay that just because I sort of go off to beyond that. But people do always come to the reasonable adjustments. But again, asking people, or just making sure that the rooms that you have, perhaps what practitioners talked about was making sure that fidgets were available for people who use those to cope with anxiety. I would say that I, as a neurotypical person, use those as well. So you're going to benefit everyone. So there's things that you can do that just make something an inclusive space. Thinking about sort of lighting, the noise levels, the size of your groups. I mean, some groups they are supposed to run around 8 and sometimes go beyond that, but that's extremely difficult for neurotypical men who are perpetrators coming into a group, and there's lots of hostilities that fly around the room, and that's the dynamics are really difficult to manage. And practitioners more broadly will say, actually, we just need smaller groups. That's even more important for neurodivergent people, where there just must be too much going on. So thinking about the size of your groups, is there opportunities to be flexible and allow people to leave the room, to gather their thoughts, feelings, emotions? And I know there can be breaks in the middle, but perhaps for some people that's not sufficient. There needs to be a space where there's any sort of sensory overload. There's other things like, particularly for ADHD men, where there is research actually out there on this. There's one paper on a perpetrator intervention, which was more an experimental study, but they someone that I'd spoken to about the research talked about like reminders, so text reminders for men who, for example, the time would just run away from them. Again, this could be useful for anyone, but sometimes we understand people with ADHD, that time management can be difficult. So just text reminders of their appointment, when that is, and setting up managing time and things like that. Again, I mentioned in the video around familiarization, some men may want to come in and know more about their environment to begin with. What's the setup of the group? What's this going to be like? Allow times to ask questions and think about busy reception areas and things like that. Some talked about in terms of actually I go down, I meet the person, we ensure it isn't at a time, for example, if it's situated within a particular centre and something going on, that they start the groups at times when it's not so busy and things like that. So there is a sort of list of things that you can consider. But I do think that a lot of these things as well, put in more broadly, would suit everyone.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. We often in the work that we do talk about autistic people and neurodivergent people as being kind of the canaries in the coal mine. Like, often we will be more sensitive or have greater level of need. Actually, the stuff that will benefit us will benefit everyone else over time. Like, they just might not notice it as quickly, that the need might not be as acute. But yeah, that really resonates with my experience. Thank you. I'm curious about what kind of and we had a question on this. What kind of response and reception have you had from the sector?
Nothing but positive, nothing but excitement, nothing but, even those who haven't got involved, who weren't able to get involved in the research, the international one, because they weren't sure what they could offer, said, please let me know about the findings of this, because I am sure I am coming across neurodivergent men all of the time. And so this is something that's been widely welcomed. I've not had anyone that said we shouldn't be looking at this. I mean, neurodiversity is just along the same lines as gender diversity, sexual diversity, ethnic diversity. It's something else that we need to be considering within the context of interventions. And I think to not go off down a road, I've said this before, where we have lots of different interventions for lots of different identities and differences. How many programs can we actually have, if that makes sense? I think the more we can think about how do we address the needs of a whole host of people, I think that's quite exciting for people. Thinking about neurodiversity helps us to think in that particular way. So yes, I've been really pleased that the response to this has been nothing but positive.
Fantastic. That is just great to hear. And are you aware of services that are starting to pioneer some of these changes? Have you had any early feedback about what impact that's having?
Well, I haven't sent out anything yet to ask. I certainly know in the context of the interviews, people were already saying that they were having higher level conversations within local authorities, not just within their intervention themselves, but local authorities around, that the conversations that had started were going to where they needed, to the people who had the power to make those changes. the interviews in themselves were spaces, and I'm going to write about this next year, became spaces in which people started to question some of their own biases, some of the neglects. They would be really reflective in terms of where they were, where I am now, and actually where I want to go now with this. So there was lots of positive around that. So in academia, we do things like impact case studies and things as part of the university research rankings and things like that. And I'm hoping at some point that once I've got these next couple of papers out, to put out maybe a big survey and find out if anyone has started to pick up some of the things that have been not just suggested by me, but perhaps some of the things that have been triggered just by sort of reading and looking further. So watch this space. It is something that I plan to do, because it'd be really great to, well, I must say as well, as part of the research, I did offer the opportunity to start up a directory, but only a couple of people, like maybe 3 or 4 places, took that up across the UK and Australia. So it wasn't enough people, and there were some blurred lines as well. So I wasn't able to make a directory, but perhaps it's something that I can push again later on, once people feel perhaps a little bit more confident that they've been able to do something that they can put out there.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, we will follow you with interest, Nicole, and we'll be delighted to add any kind of additional findings and reports to the website, where we'll be hosting the kind of the collection of research and information that we've collated as part of this summit. So do keep us up to date with how that develops. Moving to some of the questions, are there any distinct differences in how domestic abuse is perpetrated across neurotypes?
So I'm going to use an example here, because again, I'm always talking about very early days, and I'm grappling with all of this just now in a piece of writing that I'm doing as well. For me, ultimately, my research is psychosocial, and for those who aren't familiar with that, it's trying to understand both the inner worlds of the people who perpetrate domestic abuse, as well as the social context in which they live. So for me, what I've found today, using that particular lens, is that by exploring these men's lives early on, and the sorts of vulnerabilities and sort of insecurities that form part of their violence, through looking at it through this perspective, are similar across board in terms of, so we know that obviously domestic abuse is very much gendered, gendered assumptions, inequalities very much feature in the reasons for domestic abuse, but we also have to explain why certain men do so and others don't, and why some women do and others don't, why this happens within the context of same-sex relationships. So what's similar across board is that individually many men have very difficult experiences which play into, particularly earlier sort of childhood experiences, which play into their intimate relationships later on, and the sort of the ways in which they like their relationships to be. I would say what is more complicated here is that for neurodivergent people, who live in a neurotypical world, so a world not made for them, have had to learn and exert some level of control over their lives and the things that they do to provide themselves with a sense of security, familiarity, routine. We often talk about autistic people needing sort of routine and familiarity. Well, no wonder if you're living in an uncertain world, what can I do to make that more certain? And sometimes those two things can overlap, which is why I want to speak to victim survivors about this. So when we think about coercive control, there's a need to untangle what aspect of that control is coercive, but what part of that control is also needed within the context of a neurodivergent person's life, to prevent sort of spillover, sort of emotional sort of disarray and spillovers, if that makes sense. So one, coercive control is not caused, abusive coercive control is not caused by being neurodivergent, but I think it's the untangling of those aspects is something that, yet again, I will say we need a really qualified and experienced supported workforce to be able to do. And I spoke to one practitioner who, it was just incredible the way that she was able to untangle all of this and work with neurodivergent people and help them to understand what was coercive and what was actually about familiarity and that need of security that they exerted that control for in their lives, if that makes sense.
It does, Nicole, thank you. And it speaks to another question that we've had. So yeah, it's really interesting that that's come up and that you've already linked it in your answer. So actually the question that we had was from someone who, by my reading of it, was struggling with that untangling. What kind of suggestions or advice would you give someone who's grappling with that complexity of you know, what is about coercive controlling behavior and what is about autistic characteristics, uncertainty and need for routine, familiarity, that kind of thing?
As a practitioner, yes, big things that obviously have been relayed to me by a very experienced practitioner working with domestic abuse perpetrators. And my background is domestic abuse victim survivors. So when we're talking, I think in a lot of ways when we talk about working with victims, it's much simpler in a sense because we're getting them to understand that they're being abused and being controlled. When we're working with perpetrators, we're trying to get them to understand that they're abusing and they are controlling someone else. So that layer of complexity of moving to thinking about perpetration is always going to be more complex. I think for an experienced domestic abuse practitioner who is gender informed will be able to recognise some of that aspects of abusive behaviour that is when we think about the impact on the person that they are living with, what they're doing, what aspect of that is manipulative in a sense that is being done to fulfill someone's whether that be emotional needs or their views around that relationship, their entitlement within that relationship. If we think about someone who is trying to provide a certain sense of routine to their own lives, that could be, I mean, that could be being somewhere on time. It could be about I don't know, needing things to, if there's going to be change around something, that needs to be explained and not just done in the moment. But so there's differences there in terms of what that behaviour, what's the intention behind that behaviour. But we ultimately have to understand that there are many neurodivergent people in this world, and the majority of whom are not perpetrating domestic abuse against their partner. And we also know that the majority of domestic abuse perpetrated, regardless of whether people are neurodivergent or not, is being perpetrated by men. You need to hold on to the gendered aspects of that. And for me, also the vulnerability, which plays into some of the reasons why men perpetrate domestic abuse in the first place, and not make this about being neurodivergent. But that requires a whole host of skill that hopefully we will start to get more and more evidence base over time around what that looks like. Thanks,
Nicole. Yeah, and so important around our focus and not losing sight of the gendered aspect, and also that many neurodivergent people aren't perpetrating domestic abuse. So yeah, thank you for speaking to that. And I guess just as a follow-on to that question, are you aware of any research, any information, any kind of supportive resources that speak to some of this, or is this a gap that we really need to see addressed?
Huge gaps. I really invite anyone and everyone who is interested in obviously in the right space to do this sort of research to get involved, whether that be sharing information with me through my research or building upon. We need so much more around this. We already know that whilst there's some evidence base around interventions, that it's quite ambiguous. There's lots of disagreement. We're going into a whole different sort of area here now in terms of thinking about neurodiversity. Yeah, and I would like to say that the stuff out there, I did a systematic literature review for my research, and there was literally my PhD and one study in the Netherlands, and that's it. So it's, yeah, really, really at the beginning.
Yep. Pioneering stuff. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we're getting some comments through from people who are interested in further involvement.
Great.
Lovely to hear. Okay, I'm going to go to another question. I'm going to read this out. This is from Jessica. I work within a forensic outreach liaison service, and I work with individuals who have a learning disability and/or are autistic on a daily basis. We agree with the need for fidget or sensory toys as a team. However, we've hit a roadblock with infection control team in our trust. A familiar story from my work as well. Have you got any advice around this that you've implemented before? Have other people had this issue? We have considered giving each person their own fidget toy, but NHS budgets make this difficult. Have you got any experience or tips around this, Nicole?
I wish I did, because I also use fidget toys before I even wrote my first thing on neurodiversity. I used them in my interviews with the men that I interviewed. So all of the perpetrators that I interviewed, I put fidget toys on the table, who they would just pick it up and start talking. I also used it with my own students, because I always had this understanding of anxiety, my own included, of walking into a classroom space, me as a teacher, them as a student, obviously, but thinking, how can I make this a more comfortable environment for people who are experiencing anxiety? And I used to put these fidget toys, and it would start off a conversation, and then they would also pick them up, and you'd see people talking and looking up, and it helped them concentrate because they're imagining things, and it was wonderful. And now I've also hit the roadblock of no one's told me not to, but I worry about what will students now think. So what was an inviting conversation to reduce anxiety has now become perhaps a conversation that would increase anxiety, because people would say, hang on a minute, but they've touched this. And so I don't know what we do with this. It's really difficult, whether we get things that can just easily be cleaned over afterwards. It sort of takes the fun out of having some of the sensory different sensory pieces of equipment. So, but yeah, perhaps we need someone to go out there and create and make new sensory things that we can look at infection control with.
I have another reflection on this, if I may add it, which is, I think sometimes we only look at like the risk that something presents rather than the risk of not doing it. And actually, there's a really significant risk of not meeting people's sensory needs, which is that they are going to be dysregulated. They might not be able to participate. We might not see the change. And so I think sometimes we can bring some of those risk factors into our conversation. And I've seen some really productive, constructive conversations with infection control teams where we've engaged them in working with us to find a solution. It's like, okay, so if we can't do this, what can we do? How can we make it work? What are your specific concerns? Is there a way to address it? And that, yeah, so in the sensory environment work we do with hospitals, we've seen teams who are able to support people to bring in their own bedding and, you know, use different laundry detergent and things that meet sensory need that infection control has said absolutely not. It's like, okay, I actually, how do we meet the infection control requirements while also addressing the need and addressing the risk of not doing this? So I think sometimes it's a little bit about reframing that conversation as well. Okay, a final question. I think we've just got time to squeeze one in. Are you seeing, Nicole, any cross-governmental approach? You spoke about the need for this. Are you seeing engagement from them in terms of addressing the challenges in the sector, and particularly with recruitment, retention in the workforce? Yeah, is there any engagement there?
Within the domestic abuse sector, governmental wise, and thinking about, I mean, they've just put the biggest amount of funding into the domestic abuse sector that it's ever had. So on the one hand, yes, let's say that's really good in terms of thinking about perpetrator interventions. Unfortunately, it's nowhere near enough. If we're thinking about neurodiversity specifically, well, again, if we're not thinking enough about what it costs, I don't think that's there. What I have seen though, so for those who are interested, I run 2 networks. I co-coordinate one called Neurodivergence in the criminal justice system, and then I have another network that I coordinate called Neurodiversity and Domestic Abuse Practice, which is an international network. That's still building yet, but what I've seen across, particularly the first one, the one that's across the criminal justice system, I think we've got about 250, 260 members there now, and we act as a network across various spheres, so lived experience organisations, neurodivergent led, academics, HMPPS, and we're always having conversations now about neurodiversity. So for example, they've now got neurodiversity champions in prisons. So that's a new role that's been implemented more recently. We've just had a meeting with a sentencing council that's looking at neurodiversity, embedding that within sentencing. So there's lots and lots of different things going on. I've never seen so much go on. I think this all comes off the back of the neurodiversity and criminal justice review, joint review that was done across prisons and probation in 2021. So the report, I think, might be up on your website. If not, I'll send you it. So there's a lot of talk about this, and it comes off the back. I think, was it Robert Buckland? I think he was the one that sort of spearheaded this, and then as ministers do, they sort of move on. And whether it's I don't think it's got the exact same attention it used to, but there's certainly a lot of noise, a lot of interest, and a lot of separate things going on. If we could just get that into some sort of like formal strategy, would be amazing. And certainly for me, because domestic abuse sector is where I'm sort of interested in, I would like to see an awful lot more there as well. So let's see.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but Nicole, thanks again. It's been a fantastic session, really interesting and engaging, and thank you to all of our attendees. We hope you've enjoyed this webinar as part of the Grooming and Coercive Control Summit 2023, and we hope to see you at some of our other talks. It's been a pleasure hosting you today. We're Neurodiverse Connection. You can find us at ndconnection.co.uk. Follow us on Twitter at ndconnectionuk and find us on LinkedIn. And again, thanks so much for joining us, and take care.